And then they go on to say, how dare you lift the debt ceiling to $300 billion? And I really am always amused when Senator Joyce gets up to talk about debt. You know, the shadow finance minister who probably lasted the shortest period of any shadow finance minister in history. And I'm glad Senator Sinodinos nods and agrees with me. You see, I went back and I thought, well, I better have a look at what Senator Joyce is saying. Because I'm not an economist. I know Senator Joyce says he's an accountant. I wouldn't trust Senator Joyce with any of my limited accounts that I've got. But I'll tell you, he says he's an accountant. I'm only a humble fitter and machinist. But I went back and I thought, I'd better have a look at this debt issue. So the best advice I could get was from the Budget Policy Division of the Australian Treasury. Not a bad place to go, Senator Sinodinos. What do you reckon? That's about where you should go to get some advice. I know you were there during your time. I know John Howard went there. I don't think Peter Costello went there very often because he wasn't very successful. He wasn't very successful. But what they said, and this is an internal paper for discussion within the Treasury, and it says, understanding debt and its historical trends is important, as the level of debt provides one measure of the strength of public finances. Levels of public sector borrowing fluctuate in line with the economic cycle and the budget position. This paper briefly describes the various measures of debt and trends in government borrowing. And so these are the experts. These are the experts in Treasury talking about government debt. And what do we hear from Senator Joyce, the shortest-lived shadow finance spokesman in the history of the coalition? He keeps talking about gross debt. Gross debt. So what do they say? What do the experts say? They say gross debt represents a portion of the total liability a government owes to creditors. And it goes on to say the main component, it tells you what the main component is, but it says while the gross debt measure provides information on government finances, it is only a partial indicator. Now, you would agree, Senator Sinodinos, that's the facts. You could not argue against that. It's only a partial indicator. And it says gross debt does not incorporate amounts that are owed to government by other parties. Also, governments, like an individual or business, holds assets which can be sold to meet their financial obligations. To capture the asset side of the equation, net debt needs to be considered. And then it goes on to say net debt is the most commonly quoted and well-known measure of a government's financial strength. I never heard even Peter Costello, with all his failings and foibles and weakness, I never heard him ever talk about gross debt. I never heard John Howard talk about gross debt. I heard them talk about net debt. And net debt is what all the economists look at. It's what governments around the world look at. It's what the IMF looks at. It's what the OECD looks at. And they say, compared with gross debt, net debt is a better measure of a government's overall indebtedness, as it also captures the amount of debt owed to the government. So when you see Senator Joyce stand up, you have to understand that he is an accountant. And my view would be not a very good one. He's not an economist. You should rely on the experts. And then they go on in this paper. In the paper, Senator Sinodinos, if you want to go back and look at it, it's called A History of Public Debt in Australia, and it's by Katrina Marco, Mitchell Pirrie and Wilson I. Young from Treasury. They're the ones that know what they're talking about, not Senator Joyce. And they go on to say the case of Japan clearly illustrates how only considering gross debt can result in a skewed interpretation of government finances. Skewed interpretations is what the coalition want the public to look at. No honesty, but a skewed interpretation. And they say if you looked at that, then the gross debt measure for Japan is 173%. They say Canada, with a comparable amount of gross debt to France, having a comparable amount of gross debt to France, Germany and the US. But it's got a significantly lower level of net debt. So you can't look at gross debt. You can't look at it. And Senator Joyce needs to understand this. And when you talk about debt, what about debt? We get told again that we should run the government like a business. We should be a business. Well, we better not run it like Fortescue Metals. We better not run it like Twiggy Forrest with a total debt of $5.997 billion and a total equity of $3.141 billion. What's the debt-to-equity ratio for Twiggy? 190%. So I know Senator Cormann is very close to Twiggy. I know Senator Cormann would do anything the mining industry tells him to do. But, you know, when he comes in here and lectures us about debt, he should understand that the people that he's arguing for have got debt ratios of 190% plus. So don't come in here and lecture us about this.